All right, we're moving on to the second topic of the day, and that is ideology. And first, generally speaking, there are many, many different ways that ideology has been described and defined. I think no two sources will agree on any common definition. There's been cases of people describing it as some sort of subject being addressed by the system, as Althusser would put it, or other figures like Jordan Peterson would describe them as fragmented religions, as that only give partial truths that have been splintered into these ideological fragments. So I'd like to begin with the question, what is ideology?
Yeah. So a weird answer would be to say that there is, at least to some degree, let's say etymologically, but also phonetically, it comes from eidos or idea, and I think it was coined by a French psychiatrist. I've forgotten his name, and he was very much influenced by John Locke. This is, I think, 18th century France, so it gives you, or 19th century, gives you a bit of an idea of what the time was like. And it was specifically supposed to be a science by which to control the ideas, which in French means really representation. So the images that people have in their minds. So it has a specific political origin, the word itself, but it's phonetically also very close to the word eidolon in Greek, which means demon, and is also described by Plato in Book 10 of the Republic as the as a dangerous twilight, in the twilight between form and shadow, so that it's ultimately something that can be confusing. So this is just maybe a bit to show that there is however you understand language, but language is not something we just choose to say or to speak. I think very often it also speaks us. But I would say with ideology, in a maybe a more hands-on way of saying this, ideology is a theory of salvation, and it's a theory of salvation specifically that emerges during the collapse of the becoming explicit of the death of God.
Okay, on that note, I understood your explanation as it being a form of, like you mentioning Plato, a form of idolatry of ideas, in a sense, right? Where would you say that this could be found even before any sort of notion of a death of God? Could you consider certain systems of ideas in antiquity? Could you call them ideology, or is it anachronistic? Is ideology something that is tied to modernity, to the death of God?
In a general response, I think it's dangerous to apply notions or concepts or isms that are new and go back and try and find them before. But I would say this in a very in line with this, though, that what we are dealing with but ideology, again, specifically, it's a science. It's a science meant to, this is how it was conceived of, science meant to exercise control through images and representations, etc. And in some sense, the Plato's cave foretells the story, or the danger, speaks of the danger of what might happen when we confuse shadows, which are not unreal. They're real shadows. But when we take the shadows of copies to be connected to the source, or even the source itself. So in that sense, there is everything that we think through now has not been thought already, but is, in German we would say, is angelegt. So it's already, let's say, the seed was planted, yeah, but it only comes to fruition without necessity. It's not deterministic.
Okay.
But it there's a reason why we choose words like ideology.
Mm-hmm.
It's not arbitrary.
Okay.
It's not arbitrary that he comes up with that notion for what he wants to say. It is connected to what already seem to have been a problem, but in a very different light. There's no subject-object dichotomy. There is no mental representation. When the Greeks speak of being and thinking and being are not just somehow coming together, they are the same. Thinking, what you think is what is. You cannot think what is not.
Right.
But then with Plato it becomes more complicated already, because you could have this is Parmenides. With Plato you could see there could be something that we think that this is, let's just say, real or actual, but it may only be a shadow or a copy, as we would say today. So the task becomes one of trying to return. But in ideology, it becomes something else. The ideology specifically doesn't try to give any access to, let's say, the outside of the cave. It tries to be the projector of the cave and make it so that there is no exit.
Right. Interesting. So there's been many descriptions, especially in, let's say, the Marxist tradition, and I'm not too familiar with Marx, so I don't want to misrepresent him, but there's this notion that moral philosophy, metaphysics, any sort of belief systems of that sort boil down to idea
for the people.
Well, it boils down to ideology, which functions as a kind of cultural force to maintain the current system of production. And I've actually described ideology in a kind of different way. I've almost inverted that image, where I saw ideology being something that metaphysics has devolved into. So you could see metaphysics, I'd say, splitting into technics and ideology. So in order for the technological system to be maintained, the ideology functions as its symbiotic partner. What would be your perspective there?
That's exactly what I would have said, a lot less eloquently.
Oh.
So yes,
Thanks.
That's it. It's exactly it's the, so I mean, the Marxist story of history is extremely reductive, and also to look at everything purely in terms of the means of production just misses that perhaps there may have been something else. It really was at stake. But yes, indeed, with the collapse of a genuine access to what is metaphysics, the ideology becomes let's just say the operational system, even. And funnily enough, I mean, it never strikes the Marxists that they themselves are purveyors of an ideology, and specifically of a theory of salvation. Specifically, it's a neo-Christian theory of salvation. The promised land that is supposed to come at the end of the materialistic dialectical process is itself highly ideological.
After the abolition of private property, etc.
Yeah, whatever is necessary for it.
Whatever is necessary.
Yeah.
Right, so then my follow-up question to that would be, would we need to rediscover metaphysics in order to escape ideology, or is metaphysics perhaps already on a downward trend, in a sense? Like, would it just be a temporary delay of leading back into ideology, and we need to go even further back to mythical understanding?
But we can't. None of this. Look, all of this would lead only to what Baudrillard would call a simulacrum.
Right.
We can pretend that we're very mythical, and that this is happening online, right? There are people who pray to the sun god,
right?
Or they read certain reactionary writers from Italy. The name eludes me. So
okay,
it's pastiche.
Yeah,
it's pastiche.
I mean, we could also start a cult, get some drums.
Yeah, it's I mean, not drums necessarily, but maybe some flutes or something. We want Apollinian. So but all of this is nonsense. We're not Apollinians. These are not our gods.
Right.
We would have to look to those who really sense this, and these are people like Hölderlin and Heidegger and Nietzsche and others. And by the way, also Hegel. Hegel says specifically, the first page of his Science of Logic, he says metaphysics, this is a misquote, but he says effectively metaphysics has collapsed. The question of the existence of the soul, the question of the existence of God, none of this means anything anymore. So Hegel attests this. For him, and Schelling is the one who turns to myth and mythology, but these are some of the, really weird lectures. But with Hölderlin, what does Hölderlin say? Hölderlin says the gods have fled. This is the godsless, die götterlose Nacht, the night without gods. We can pretend that we're pagans. We can pretend, that we go to Stonehenge and do rituals or so. And I know people do this, but it's ultimately, as you know, it looks ridiculous because it is.
In online terminology, people would call that LARPing. Live action role play.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
Right.
And also the same with metaphysics. So we can deal with, look at the metaphysics of Hegel's science of logic. It is a scientific. It's extraordinary. It even has its terrifying beauty, but it isn't the awe-inspiring metaphysics of old. The question, though, that is much so a rediscovery of metaphysics. Yes, but I think Heidegger says somewhere it's dangerous to awaken or to try and wake up the dead.
Right. But what about living traditions? I'd say people in the Islamic world are not familiar with Hegel, but they are very familiar still with the living culture and tradition of asking these fundamental questions.
Yeah, but that's their tradition. Right.
The problem is the emptiness of tradition in the West.
But they're also taken. Look, the little that I know about the living tradition, and I told you before, and I never speak about my private life, but I have spent some not insignificant time in the Arabic world, in Jordan and Syria, and you have a very different, you have a completely different connection to it. But yes, they have all of this, but it's also, look at some of the countries, they're completely technicized. They're building, as you know, utopian cities in the desert that are literally the Tower of Babel. And there are ideas for building new cities, right?
Yeah.
A wall that's going through the desert that will house 9 million people.
Yeah.
These are insane fantasies. None of them will ever come to be. They will come to pass without ever coming to be. But I would say that they are just as taken by the technical world, maybe not completely sucked into it, and but it's, as I said before, it's in the first part, it is a colonizing project that is ultimately uprooting. What we have to deal with in the European American Western Occidental tradition is and that's my question ultimately, is what is worthy and necessary to be delivered over into, because we are in the twilight.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by twilight?
Well, what is any, what is any of it?
Right.
There's no, you can have all the
there's no certainty.
debates.
There's no certainty we can arrive at.
Well, forget certainty. There's no truth.
Okay.
There's no center that brings anything together. There's, except of course for the centralizing forces of technics to a certain degree, but it's all sort of just teetering out, as it were. It's a flatten, you could say. And so what we have to ask is what relationship do we have with the Christian tradition, for example, or with the Greeks or with the Romans and Homer, or the Platonic Aristotelian metaphysics that drives so much of our technical scientific world, insofar as, for example, to Plato's Platonistic forms, not maybe Plato, but we speak of formats.
Mm-hmm.
And formats is something that we can replicate. So there is a certain, in some weird way, science or technology makes Platonistic forms operational, applicable. And they are, weirdly enough, timeless and spaceless. They can be applied almost anywhere at any time. So
But that's applied paradoxically, right? So it's like they're set as timeless, but they yet become deconstructed and reconstructed again in very short time in science, in the practice of science. They just become paradoxically constructed as timeless for a certain period of time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so the question becomes, for me, well, I guess this is the question, is if anything remains of this, and not just this vast colonizing project that uproots everything. So in a nutshell, you could say, does anything remain except for nihilism?
Right.
So the question must become, what should be, or in which way do we stand in a relation, in what kind of relationship do we stand to memory?
Okay. Right.
So a rediscovery of metaphysics, again, could just be LARPing. And it's, right? So we can, this is the funny thing, you could say you're a Neo-Platonist. Mm-hmm. Then I say, I'm a Neo-Aristotelian. All of these debates are being had.
Yeah.
But they're ultimately just, urban intellectual projects. They're not felt. I mean, we can quarrel on for, so Plato argues this and Aristotle this, blah, blah, blah. But it means ultimately nothing. It doesn't, it's intellectually stimulating, but it doesn't capture our very hearts and beings.
I would say that, I agree, and I would say, I would put it in the way that, essentially, no matter what cult you say you're in, we are all in the same cult. Like, most people would check their phones at the same times and hang around on the same websites and hang around. Like, the actual amount of the day spent in activities is spent in a very similar way, using the same technological devices, using the same. So we're kind of all participating. Yeah, we all pretend to be participating in different LARPs, but we're participating in the same LARP.
Yeah, and it's, I think that one has to be self-critical enough to be aware of that ultimate of that danger of LARP. And again, any sort of reawakening of any sort of ism, be it Neo-Platonism, Neo-Aristotelianism, Neo-Parmenideism, is ultimately, I think, purely intellectual. There's an incredible film. It's not actually very profound in its story. I forgot what, I think it's a British dystopian film, but people are not supposed to have any emotions. I forgot completely. It's not. Do you know which one it is? It's recent.
I think I've seen it.
It's about maybe 10 years old or so. And there's nothing very, this is an old story. It's by the way, it's also striking that it's always the English who come up with dystopian. No, they invented the novel. The dystopian novel is an English invention. So,
1984.
Well, no, even before.
Yeah,
Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein.
Oh, okay.
In the 19th century. And then she actually writes The Last Man, which is a fantasy about how humanity ends. And this is written in the early 19th century.
But what can one do, though? What can one do if it's all a LARP? Where is the door to the non-LARP world?
Yeah. So in that film, there's one scene where what they do is they stand at these big screens, and and one of them does nothing but solve problems from metaphysics all day long. So Plato argues that blah blah blah, but Aristotle argues that blah blah blah, and this is ultimately what this now, I think, amounts to for the most part. And the question that you just asked is the question that I think disturbs Heidegger after he finishes Being in Time, because he begins to realize that even phenomenology is doomed to fail, and we cannot just only begin from scratch either. We cannot just cut and bracket and begin anew from zero, as so many at the time tried, also Paul Nator. So that question that you have is there's no answer to it that I can give now, but it's
is there like a minimal answer, like something like trying to observe and reduce the engagement that one has with technology and trying to observe what it does to you.
No, I would lean into our time and fully see, if we begin to see in technology, not just the machines that, we're using this thing here and this thing here to do this, and then people watch this on YouTube or somewhere else.
Yeah, even this conversation is just a simulation for most people who watch it.
Well, probably it's just going to be something they do while they wash their dishes,
Right.
So it's but what do we see? And this is not something for everyone. This is something for a few, to begin to see that there is a connection to that which has been, that is now playing itself out. Right. So we can find hints and and paths that are already sort of there, but now they come fully to the fore thanks to the operations of technology. So there's a sense that's in a way lurking within it, but it would mean so exactly the opposite of what it's not reactionary at all. It's not it's fully lean into what the technological age really means and see it and but then bring it back into the entirety of Spengler tried to do that,
right,
with the Faustian,
right,
so
right,
for example. So there's a hint. Spengler, The Decline of the Occident, is one of the strongest examples from in terms of trying to articulate that.
All right. I think that's a good point to end this part, and it's a good kind of transition into the next topic, which will be technology.